Those characters are really great because of this quote that I pulled up from Jordan Peterson.
A harmless man is not a good man. A good man is a very, very dangerous man who has that under voluntary control.
That's Aragorn through and through. It's so good.
The thing is, you gotta say it with the accent, so it's like a harmless man is like it's not a dangerous man. You want to be a monster. And then only after that, then you can be a real man.
Sounds like Kermit the Frog.
No, when you think about it, Jordan Peterson kind of talks like Kermit.
He does.
It's like the collapse, the West man.
It's like Zoink Scoobs.
Hello there.
Don't have a good day. Have a great day.
Talk to me, Goose.
I'm gonna steal the Declaration of Independence.
Why so serious?
World! I could do this all day.
Are you watching closely?
Welcome everybody to the One Film Podcast. I'm your host Seth Mossberg, and my co-hosts. You need to see the video if you're listening to this. There, Annika hopped in the call.
I am darkness. I am the night.
Annika hopped in the call with her Hobbit hood on. William tried to imitate her, but Annika was actually in the Lord of the Rings style. I know the Hobbit is different, but you still have your costume? You didn't recycle it or put it back in the closet?
This is just the cloak. It's just like the cape I made for us.
Yeah. Okay, cool. You were, which Hobbit were you from the Hobbit again?
I was Feely.
Okay.
Yeah. One of
Very
the
cool.
brothers.
So it's not we're not quite to the Hobbit. We might get to the Hobbit soon, but we're gonna start with Lord of the Rings, and we'll even see how far we get into the Lord of the Rings, because I forgot there's a lot of movie in these movies.
I will say I am one of the people who actually did watch every single of the of the extended edition bonus features, every single piece of it. I am one of those people. So
the bonus features or the extended edition?
For the extended edition, how you can go into the bonus scene.
Oh, okay.
I watched both. I watched the extended. I watched the extended edition, and then you have the bonus features, and I did. I spent the entire day doing that when I was really young. I don't know why, but I did.
Yeah, I just saw that Marcus Theaters is releasing the extended edition trilogy for a 12-hour marathon in theaters. They're going to accommodate, they'll give you, or they have deals on food for whole meals when you go there. They'll just have them properly spaced out so you won't miss, they won't be overlapping. So this is a big thing. And I know that a lot of people, I feel like you either really like Lord of the Rings and you only watch the extended edition trilogies, you might watch them once, or you don't really care at all. There's really only those parties. Are there Lord of the Rings haters? Because there's Star Wars haters for sure. Maybe that's because Star Wars has gone downhill, but do you think that there's really Lord of the Rings haters in the same way?
I think there's people who are definitely maybe hate the fandom or annoyed by the fandom, but I think it's a lot more difficult to disrespect the movies and the books, because I think everyone, you kind of at some point have to acknowledge how great not only the original work of Tolkien was, but also how incredible Peter Jackson did at adapting it. You kind of have to respect it to a certain degree in a way that I don't think exactly Star Wars does. But once you start getting into Hobbit and Rings of Power, I think that's where you start getting a little more of that controversy from the general public.
I agree. Sure. No, that's a good perspective with the trying to figure out, Star Wars is original stories, and maybe that's why Rings of Power hasn't been so well received, is because it's less of based off of the main books and just going and doing its own thing, even if it's slightly based off of the Lord of the Rings universe. But yeah, I think I can't say that. I want to say the books are really good. I know the books are really good. I just haven't read them myself to say that. But yes, I believe the reason they became one of the reasons they became such a great movie series is because it's such a great book, and it can be adapted like that. Now there were changes made to it for sure, but I think starting with the basis of a good story is pivotal for adapting a movie series or adapting a book series into a movie series.
I think, in my opinion, the reason that the Lord of the Rings movies did so well is because they feel real. And the reason they feel real is because Tolkien not only wrote the books, which I've listened to audiobook versions. Some people say that counts, some people say that doesn't, but whatever. So I've listened to them. And Tolkien, essentially, he was dissatisfied with the lack of lore that English history had. And so he decided he was just going to make something up that was more interesting. So what we see in the books and then what was taken out of the books and put into the movies is a fraction of the world that Tolkien created. And I've only scratched the surface in my personal research, but he made the whole languages for the elves, for the dwarves, for the ents. Like he drew maps and he built histories, timelines, genealogies. Like the depth he went to create the world of Middle Earth is absolutely insane. And so that's why I feel like, at least me personally, I always come away from watching the movies or listening to the books feeling like I've experienced something that actually happened. And I almost have to remind myself, like, no, this is fictional, this is fake. And it feels so real because Tolkien did such an incredible job at creating a world that did feel real. And so I think that's also why the movies have stood the test of time, is because there's just a certain authenticity to them and to the story that is just so hard to grasp, I think, in a lot of modern media.
The worlds feel lived in. It often feels like in Star Wars, the places they go, especially the new locations, are built for the story's convenience. I'm talking more modern Disney Star Wars. More modern Disney Star Wars is made with that game mentality of like, we have to go to this next checkpoint and then this next checkpoint and gather this item, and then you pick up this person and go to this next checkpoint. It feels like a game, but the locations feel like they're only designed for that purpose. Whereas obviously, I think it's very it's very well known that Tolkien wrote kind of the whole Bible of the Lord of the Rings world with those languages, with those people groups, with the descriptions of everything in it, and then pulled the story out of that instead of building the world around the story. I think that does wonders for the story.
The other thing about these films that they really are mythical, and that's because like Tolkien designed these as an origin myth, as Annika already mentioned, for England and for the British Isles, and he really draws a lot of inspiration from a variety of different sources. And like again, like he does a whole bunch of world building. Like I've read the Silmarillion, I haven't read the original trilogy, ironically enough, but like there's literally so much about it, and it really enhances like knowing the lore of Middle Earth when you watch the films. Like, you know, when like Gandalf is like fighting the Balrog, you know that it's actually not just like an old man versus like this giant scary demon. Like there's a whole actual mythology behind it, behind everything that people saying. You can actually look into the place that what they're talking about. So it makes everything much more richer when you actually know the context for what's going on there, which makes again like the world even more awesome and interesting, and it makes you want to explore it more, which is another really cool thing about like these films, is that they like had to like simplify a lot of like this the story of Lord of the Rings and like the world that Tolkien had built, while at the same time trying to capture the essence of it. And I think that's the trilogy was one of the few examples of a really good adaptation, both on a thematic level, but also on like some like the technical level as well, and staying true to the heart of the source, but also making it easier for people who like don't like spend like 40 hours listening to like one book from a trilogy that's like really long, but it actually makes it more impressive. Because like I like watched parts of the film, I had no idea what was going on, and then I looked into it and I became more interested and led me towards kind of my state today. So I think that's one of the greatest praise that I'll just kind of give out to the trilogy, is that, like, they did an excellent job in capturing like the essence of Tolkien's like the themes, but also like the world, but also making it understandable for people who just like want to like watch a film, but also making it not too simple either, so that it's dumbed down and so it doesn't completely annoy the fans, because you know fans are going to nitpick everything, but I think they still did like a really good job with that.
So I know you want to get into themes and characters and stuff, but kind of bouncing off what Will said, I think another thing that just helps with that understanding what's going on is obviously Lord of the Rings is one of those where it's a lot of names, and as my roommate likes to say, there's an astounding amount of blonde men that are very hard to keep track of. The production design and the costumes and the scenic elements supported, some of it is described in the books and some of it was from the mind of Peter Jackson and the team that he had, but the different groups of people and the worlds that they live in, so their costumes, their houses, their bedding, the set dressing, everything supports the idea that they're different people groups. So the Shire is based more on like the British countryside and farming, very agricultural, everything's very colorful, bright, warm, sunny, everything like that. And then you move to the elves, and that's more inspired by, I feel like, what we think of as traditional medieval mythology, with the flowing robes and capes and the marble sculptures and everything, and that's very, very fancy. And then you move into Rohan, which is much more inspired by the Celtic side of England. I think northern England, but don't quote me on that. And then Gondor is more of that rugged, I think Eastern European aesthetic. And so I think that design helped to support the being able to keep these different people groups straight, and the reason why that their interactions are very different. So that was just very ingenious on the part of the production design and the people who are a part of making that.
Keeping up with all of the looks of the different characters, like not even just hobbits and dwarves are short, elves are tall, orcs are gross, things like that. The style of all of them, the hobbits are shy and timid and don't want to fight. The elves are very graceful. The orcs are very brash and like their armor is jagged and rugged and all that. Like all those things add to the types of people that are not people necessarily, but types of creatures and species that are all in one, and you know who's a part of who. Do either of you know kind of the relationship between Tolkien and C.S. Lewis? And they kind of had a rivalry, but they were also good friends, I think. And I know Tolkien kind of pushed Lewis to write a story that turned into the Chronicles of Narnia. Do you guys know more backstory about those interactions?
I don't remember exactly. I do think I remember something about Treebeard being the personification of C.S. Lewis in Tolkien's writing, because Treebeard's moving slow, talking slow, like kind of overanalyzing everything, partially because that's what Ents do. But from my understanding, that's kind of my only little tidbit that I know, is that he wrote that character sort of to spite Lewis, but they were definitely friends. And then I can't remember which, but C.S. Lewis also put a Tolkien-inspired character in Narnia. I'm just not
Reepicheep.
off the top of my head recalling who that was. Oh, okay.
It was Reepicheep. That's funny.
Still one of my favorite characters. Well, Tolkien and Jack, or C.S. Lewis, as he's known, but Tolkien called him Jack, were very good friends, because if I'm correct, Tolkien was one of the people who was most influential in leading C.S. Lewis from atheism to Christianity, although Tolkien was a Catholic and C.S. Lewis became more of a Protestant, but they were still very, very, very close friends. And they were part of like the Inklings. The Ink Blocks? The Inkling.
Yeah,
I think it's
like
the Inklings. Yep. And they were very close and like very much bounced back off each other. Like, you know, you often hear like the thing that like Tolkien did like allegory, whereas C.S. Lewis like fully went in for it with the Chronicles of Narnia. So they were very close, and you can very much see the inspiration between the two of their writers. Quick question: have any of you guys like watched the Tolkien film, like the film called Tolkien that came out like 2 or 3 years ago? Just out of curiosity, because I did relatively like a year ago.
I heard of it. It's got Nicholas Hoult, which I know his face from other things, but yes, I am interested in seeing it. I have not seen it. It would be very interesting, and also knowing the actual history and how it works with like how well adapted was this historical movie.
Okay, yeah, it does. This is a side note, but yeah, it was. I would say it's pretty good, and it does give a pretty good understanding for like kind of like the framework and the context that Tolkien had before he went into writing Lord of the Rings and the inspirations that he had and stuff like that. But yeah, C.S. Lewis and Tolkien were very close friends.
You mentioned Tolkien was kind of the driving force to helping Lewis become a Christian. And I believe there was a quote from him that said, I might be wrong, but I believe that there's something along the lines of, because they were part of this writers club, they were talking about mythology, and you kind of brought up British mythology and how he was unsatisfied, so he wrote Lord of the Rings to kind of fill that gap, or at least in his mind. He knew that Lewis really liked that type of mythology, the modern mythology or English mythology, and he said, you love this mythology of the heroes and the villains and the sacrificial love, but yet this real mythology of Jesus Christ coming down to earth, you don't believe that actually happened. But he also used it as a parallel to say, hey, we write these reflections of Jesus to show off the truth of love and sacrifice and adventure and stories and the climaxes and the ebbs and flows, and yet we have that in a book called the Bible. And why would we not seriously, if we take things like Lord of the Rings and the Chronicles of Narnia seriously, we should really be taking the Bible seriously, especially because those books have direct correlations to the Bible. Tolkien once said, "We have come from God, and inevitably the myths woven by us, though they contain error, will also reflect a splintered fragment of the true light, the eternal truth that is with God. Indeed, only by myth-making, only by becoming sub-creator and inventing stories can man aspire to the state of perfection that he knew before the fall. Our myths may be misguided, but they steer, however shakily, toward the true harbor, while materialistic progress leads only to a yawning abyss and the iron crown of the power of evil."
After all, the magic of myths or fairy stories is not an end in itself. It exists to serve virtue and satisfy certain primordial human desires.
But myths are fiction. The stories they tell aren't true. They're lies and therefore worthless, even though breathed through silver. They're just beautiful lies. You can't seriously believe in fairy tales.
Why not? I can, in fact, I do.
But this is preposterous. How can you seriously believe a lie?
Oh, Jack, myths are not lies. In fact, they're the very opposite of a lie. Myths convey the essential truth, the primal reality of life itself.
Go on.
Well, you see, we have been duped into using the word myth as being synonymous with a lie, because we have been duped into accepting the first real lie of materialism.
And what is that?
That is the hideous claim that there is no supernatural order to the universe. You're acting as if myths are mere arbitrary inventions of fiction, as if we pull them out of thin air. But what you don't understand is that we make things by the law in which we are made. We create because we are created. Creativity, imagination, is God's imageness in us. We tell stories because God is a storyteller. In fact, he is the storyteller. We tell our stories with words. He tells his story with history.
But perhaps it isn't his story. Perhaps it's only your story. How can you know that your story, the story that you believe, the Christian story, is any more real than the other stories?
But don't you see, it isn't my story. It's his story. You're acting as if Christianity is one myth among many. It's not. It's the true myth. Christianity really happened. Jesus really existed. So did Pilate. And yet it is this true story that makes sense of all the other stories. It is the archetype. It is the story in which all the other stories have their source, and the story to which all the other stories point. It has everything. It has catastrophe and its opposite, what we might call eucatastrophe. It has the joy of the happy ending, the sudden joyous turn in the story that is essential to all myths. It has to a sublime degree this joy of deliverance, this evangelium, this fleeting glimpse of the real joy, to which all other joys are but a distant echo.
Whoa! That's a lot to comprehend, but it's so well put. He's just saying we are sub-creators. We are reflecting God as people made in his image because he's the great creator. And so we try and replicate that, whether we acknowledge it or not, through our own versions of creativity. And I think writers especially feel that as God's writing out or has written the entire history of the world from start to finish and is watching it play out. We, in the same way as creatives, or at least I as a creative, others as writers, can have that process from beginning to end as sub-creators and reflect that back to God and saying this is where we get it from, as long as we believe that and attribute it to that. That's a great quote. Anyways, all right, now that we're 20 minutes into the episode, we can talk about the movies. And I definitely think we're going to need a part 1 and part 2 because, yes, there's so much to talk about. So many characters to talk about, moments, locations, fun facts behind the scenes. Where do you want to start? Maybe the Shire, where all good things start?
Start in the Shire with the characters we meet first. I mean, technically, yes, the movies start with the prologue explaining how everything kind of got to the point where we're at by the time the actual Bilbo's birthday party starts. But yeah, I think something that's interesting, especially comparing the works of C.S. Lewis and the works of Tolkien, is this, kind of the joke of C.S. Lewis saying, if people don't understand that this lion is supposed to be Jesus by the end, I'm done. But Tolkien took a different approach where almost every single one of his characters is a savior character or a Christ character in a different way and to a different degree. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really clever because it steers away from that allegory sort of type of story into more of a more widely consumable story, but people are still picking up on those themes of this is what true heroism looks like, this is what good leadership looks like, this is what sacrificial love looks like. And I think that's just brilliant.
Whereas C.S. Lewis kind of had an obvious Jesus character, and even J.K. Rowling, when she kind of let it loose that Harry is kind of a Jesus character where he's a savior and she was hinting at it, but she didn't want to give it away because she didn't want to give the last book away. That's still directly an allegory for the biblical story. And yes, I've heard that it's pretty obvious that Tolkien split them up into the different characters to kind of throw them off the trail, but still make it a great story. They each have their own qualities that are good, and they differ from other people's qualities that are good. That's what kind of makes them a team, is that they each have something different that brings the team together and can unify them. And that's kind of seen more in the second and third movie, because the Fellowship doesn't get their stuff together until later in the first movie. But yeah. Did Tolkien write The Hobbit first or after The Lord of the Rings?
He wrote The Hobbit first, and it was published first. So it's one of like those weird things where everyone assumes The Hobbit is the prequel, but technically speaking, The Lord of the Rings is the sequel.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Hobbit was definitely much more meant to be a children's book, a little more along the lines of the Chronicles of Narnia series. And then I think it was after Tolkien wrote that he realized the potential this world held. And then as he began to write Lord of the Rings, it became a little bit more of a mature, still I think family-friendly story, but more mature with some deeper themes. And The Hobbit really is a very silly book. Like, I think we forget that, and I think that's one of the reasons, and this is a whole different conversation, why the Hobbit movies as they were made didn't work, was because the source material wasn't the same. Yeah. So the Hobbit in itself is much more silly, much more lighthearted. The characters really aren't as serious or have as big of goals or intentions, and so yeah, that's just a difference between the two.
Yeah, the Hobbits all around are kind of convicting to watch, because they're so happy in their little homes, eating their good food and living the life. And it's their worst fear is going out on an adventure. And sometimes I feel that as an introvert, but it's definitely their lifestyle. They want to just kick back, relax, and that's their festivals, their celebrations are all about just relaxing and having a good time. And it's tough. It's a bigger deal than it should be when Frodo is asked to go on this adventure. And it puts him in a place where he's like, what am I going to do? Because he knows what needs to be done, but maybe I'm thinking more of Bilbo, because I did see The Hobbit the first before I saw Lord of the Rings. I know Bilbo didn't want to leave. He wanted to stay in his comfy home, but Frodo was like, this needs to be done, and he just happened to drag all his friends with him.
Well, something that I think is interesting is originally Bilbo was only taking the ring to Rivendell. Like that was the purpose of his quest. So he thought he was going to go see the elves, have a great time, look around, see his uncle, and then come back. And I think that's something that's really interesting as we get later in the movies, and it's just Sam and Frodo out on their own. And there's a couple of times where they're contemplating turning back. And I'm pretty sure it's Sam says, if we turn back now, there will be no Shire to go back to. Like, this evil will spread so far that the peaceful home will no longer be peaceful, and will no longer be beautiful, and will no longer be safe. And so they're saying, they're almost rejecting the nature and the culture that they've been raised in, to just sit back and kind of let the outside world be the outside world. And they're going out and they're fighting that, and saying that we have to actively fight against this evil, otherwise it will come in and overtake everything that is good. And so that's another piece where we almost see those two characters fighting for the home that they will otherwise lose, where it would definitely be easier to just turn around and go back home. They can't do that, because if they do, eventually there just won't be a home to return to.
Have you seen that edit where it's like every time Samwise takes like a step, it's always what was like, this is the farthest I've been from home. Like, yeah, I just love the fact that like somebody edited the entire trilogy with that. And I haven't watched it, but I kind of wanted to, just to how silly and serious that is.
This is the furthest I've been from the Shire. It'd be so boring, but it'd be so funny. I also love the edits of the whole Lord of the Rings trilogy, but only when Legolas talks to Frodo. And it's like 2 scenes. It's not that many.
Just one final thing. They're taking the Hobbits to Isengard, like that music edit.
You kind of brought it up earlier with how the Hobbit movies were made and how there's such a jump in production, same as the Lord of the Rings with books were just so out there and good that people had to pay attention. Same way that the movies were made. They used a lot of forced perspective, which was not new. Forced perspective had been used for a while, but it took a lot of effort to make them look good and real with the moving carts, the tables, all of those things. And they did really well. The tough part is hearing Ian McKellen's comparison between filming The Hobbit and filming The Lord of the Rings, and how I think it's an unofficial term for green screen phobia or something now, where actors just don't want to do it because there's nothing to react to. They kind of did that with the Star Wars prequels, where they just used green screen for everything. And they did that for The Hobbit because they had new ways to make it force perspective and make them shorter and Gandalf seem normal size and all that. But he really was struggling on the set of The Hobbit, whereas with The Lord of the Rings, they were in the same room. They might not have been making direct eye contact, but they were still playing off of each other, and it helped a lot. Even I've seen so many videos of moving tables, because the tables have two separate pieces and they have to move in sync. Film nerd here. Forced perspective is very easy to do with a static camera, but when you add a moving camera, it makes it a little bit harder, and they took on that challenge and made it look good. They had moving carts, they had tables, like I already said, they had the raised platforms, they had some CGI, sure. They also did it in other ways to do it practical, dressing up little people in the same outfits for shots from behind. So they didn't see their faces. They still did some face replacement, but they couldn't do that as easily, so they relaxed on that for a little bit. But they had little people jump and hug Gandalf or Ian McKellen for that Hobbit hug or something like that. It's very creative the way they did it, and that even things like that, we're using little people in their production. Now, if they're just using CGI for the new ones, either whether Hobbit or if they have short people in the Rings of Power or something, that now those little people are kind of out of a job if they're not using that technique. So it's kind of a film purist thing of like a mix between practical and CGI is the best way to do it. It's not one or the other. People think that all CG is bad and all practical is good. Well, it's really not either in between. It's an in-between, and I think The Lord of the Rings nailed that, partly because that's what they were limited to. But you see it still holds up. I don't think there's much in all 12 hours of the movie that falls flat even today in 2024. It's crazy.
No, there's Legolas fighting the Oliphant is the only moment where I'm always like,
oh yeah. No, he like slides down the trunk.
But yeah, out of all the hours and hours, and that one transition shot of Elrond, that one's but it's like a bad Photoshop. I don't know if you'll be able to find it just off the bat, but it's those two shots that always make me cringe. But yeah, as opposed to 14 hours of content and you have those moments, it's like, I'll let them pass.
You just start looking on YouTube. You start to see a consensus of what people think of the movies, which movies, the TV show. It's just, why is The Hobbit not as good as The Lord of the Rings? Why is The Lord of the Rings a masterpiece? Things like that just titles that show, it gives you all you need to know. You know what people think about this, and it's really cool.
A good way to kind of move the conversation along is talking about the ring as really the main character of the movie. It's called The Lord of the Rings. It's not called The Adventures of Frodo and Sam or King Aragorn. Like, it's the Lord of the Rings, and the ring symbolizes basically evil, and the whole journey is destroying this thing that only brings evil and destruction. And it's something that I really only noticed on my last rewatch with my friends, is that people are throughout the movie, there's certain people, mostly the men of Gondor, which I think is an interesting choice, because the race of men within the world is kind of how we see ourselves, sort of. You talk about your everyman in storytelling. You have to have a character or a group of characters through which the audience can see themselves. And for us, it's a little bit the Hobbits, but I think mostly the characters who are among the race of men. But within that subgroup of people, they're always talking about how they're going to take the ring and they're going to use it as a weapon for themselves. And they're like, we're going to fight Sauron with the power of the ring. And Sam and Frodo and Gandalf are consistently saying, like, no, this thing only has the power to destroy. And it said, no matter what you do, no matter what your intentions, it's always and only ever going to destroy. And that's why Gandalf can't even touch it, because he knows that if he, even in his good intentions, and we see it more in that scene with Galadriel at the pool, she says, even if I have the best of intentions and I'm going to use this power, this incredible power for good, it's going to corrupt me and it's going to bring death and destruction. And so I think that it's interesting, kind of in the way that God has entrusted us with the gift of the Spirit to be able to fight sin, is that Gandalf gives the ring to the hobbits, who are in the world of Tolkien like considered the lowliest of the low, but because of their pureness of hearts, they're the only ones who are able to withstand the power of the ring for a long period of time. And I think that's cool to see how, sort of as in the same way that Jesus says, to the least of these will go the kingdom of God, you know, Gandalf says, to the least of these I'm going to entrust this incredible power because you're the only ones capable of destroying it.
Yeah, I knew the ring was an analogy of something, but I like the way you put that. I did find this meme of the Lord of the Rings trilogy from the ring's perspective. Hand, hand, river, dirt, golem, hobbits, pockets, pockets, finger, envelope, fire, hand, neck, neck, finger, hobbits, neck, 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 pocket, finger, lava. Just throwing that out there. Good meme.
The real quest was the friends that carried me along the way.
There you go. No more needs to be said.
Can we talk about Aragorn?
We can talk about. Oh yes. Let's talk about Aragorn.
Aragorn, and not that one like a fantasy novel that came out like in the 2000s that they made a bad movie about.
Yeah, we talked about that.
Aragorn.
I think in the How to Train Your Dragon episode, because it's Aragorn with an E, and it's like live action dragon that didn't look that good and wasn't that great of a movie. But Isaac brought it up. Annika, is that Aragorn's sword that you have? Is that what it?
Yeah.
I can't recognize. I can't recognize swords, so it's not even to scale.
No.
Yeah.
Small.
It's Annika sized.
It's a little more manageable for me.
Yeah.
I think this might be a bold statement, but it's also been made before, so maybe not. I firmly believe that Aragorn is the best picture of healthy masculinity that has ever been written, and especially has ever been put to screen. I think in this day and age, where I think sometimes media can be so polarizing, there is no room for characters to be nuanced, for characters to be flawed, for characters to have weaknesses, to be afraid of anything. And this goes for both genders, I think. You either have your girl boss, or you're kind of like Rambo type character, or you have the ones that are sort of weak and wimpy and are supposed to be that way for whatever reason. But Aragorn in the story, in the books, he is much more excited to be the king. In the movies, he's much more hesitant, which I think makes for a better choice for a trilogy of movies, because you kind of need some sort of that, like, kind of accepting his role as a leader, accepting his role as a king. But I think the incredible part about it is that even as he's killing these orcs, throughout those scenes where he's like lopping off heads and stuff, there's these beautiful moments of intimacy with other characters where he's kind and he's quiet. And like in the Fellowship, sort of his first sort of one-on-one interaction with Frodo is where Frodo tries to give him the ring because he doesn't want it anymore, and he thinks that he'll be better at protecting it than Boromir, who's just kind of gone off the rails. But Aragorn turns it away and he says, no, you have to do this. And he says, I would have gone with you to the end. But he knows that Frodo is going away on his own. And then he goes and he kills a whole bunch of orcs. And then Boromir dies defending Merry and Pippin. And literally right after he lops off the head of this humongous orc, he runs over to his friend and he comforts him in his dying moments, and he sheds a tear. He even gives him a kiss, which in our modern context, it's like, ew, gay. But it's not at all, because he's showing this brotherly love, like this genuine brotherly love and respect that he has for Boromir as a warrior, who's also just given his life to protect the little ones who couldn't protect themselves. There's also some great moments that are only in the extended editions, which I really am sad, because in the theatrical editions, the relationship between him and Eowyn is a little sus because it does seem like he's entertaining her interests while knowing he won't reciprocate. But in the extended editions, you see how from his perspective, he's caring for her as a mentor or a father figure would, but she is interpreting it as romantic love. But then as soon as he sees that that's where her interests lie, he shuts it down and he says, you're not actually in love with me, you're in love with the idea of me. And then she's able to turn around and find her true love in another incredible character, Faramir, who no one appreciates enough. But it's just that whole dichotomy of a man who is strong enough to protect the people he loves at any and all costs, while also being tender towards those who are weaker, to those who actually need help and guidance. He's not killing all these beasts for the body count, or like just to do it so that people think he's cool, or even to prove that he should be the king. He's doing it in from an actual place where he wants to save Middle-earth and he wants to save these people. And then only after that does he accept the mantle of king. And then at the very end, like literally 5 minutes after he gets the crown put on his head, he has the entire kingdom bow down to these little hobbits who no one ever would have thought of as heroes. And he says, my friends, you bow to no one, because he's respecting them and he's humbling himself in the same way as Jesus humbled himself in order to lift them up. And it's so good. I could go on for hours.
Yeah, Aragorn is I wouldn't say Chad because I don't like the connotations, but like it's like he's the bomb. The guy. It's like, you know, like when we were talking about Arcane, we love the character of Vander. Vander's like great, but then like Aragorn's just better.
Vander and Aragorn could be discussed, or they could be similar. You could talk about the things they have in common, but they're still different in their own ways. But yes, those characters are really great because of this quote that I pulled up from Jordan Peterson.
A harmless man is not a good man. A good man is a very, very dangerous man who has that under voluntary control.
That's Aragorn through and through. It's so good.
The thing is, you gotta say it with the accent, so it's like a harmless man is like it's not a dangerous man. You want to be a monster. And then only after that, then you can be a real man.
Sounds like Kermit the Frog.
No, when you think about it, Jordan Peterson kind of talks like Kermit.
He does.
It's like the collapse, the West man.
It's like Zoink Scoobs.
Well, how crazy here.
I think it was the AI Bible official who does amazing AI art and basically puts Bible passages into AI video generators and makes it look so amazing. Anyways, one of the things they did was they fan cast what an Old Testament Bible movie would look like, even though they've had multiple of them. They used big name actors. They cast Viggo Mortensen as King David. And I think that would be so perfect. Maybe that's just because the only thing I've seen him in is Aragorn, and that probably a very similar comparison. But I think even now, Viggo looks amazing for like mid-50s, I think. And he would play a good middle-aged King David, I think.
We've been talking about Aragorn, and he is like a really cool character, and you get one of like the best throughout the entire trilogy because you get to see his arc moving from Ranger to the King, and like also like his romance with Arwen, which is again one of like those really beautiful romances. And then I think it's interesting to contrast that with basically the opposite, which is Gollum. And I've heard Gollum described as failed masculinity in comparison to Aragorn for his almost awesome masculinity compared to like Aragorn and his near epitome of like true masculinity. Because like Gollum is like he's shriveled, he's like hides in the shadows and like in caves and like eats fish while raw and sings weird songs to himself. So he's like he's very much like decrepit, but at the same time he's also kind of like pitiable, which is really interesting. Because whenever I watch like especially the second film, because you get to see a little bit of him in the first film, but like especially in the second film, like you really start to feel for the character, and you're like, oh, you know, maybe he can actually kind of redeem himself and pull himself away and like actually sort of be released from the ring, and he kind of gets to that point, but then ultimately he doesn't. And it's just, I think it's a really interesting character to have a conversation about, like in comparison to like the ring, which his relationship to the ring is so unique and how it corrupts and warps him. So what's kind of like your guys' thoughts on Gollum, I guess?
I think you're right. It's the opposite of versions of masculinity. I want it and I want it now. not waiting for it to come to fruition, not waiting for the better thing, not doing what is necessary. Like, I don't even know if the ring has a good use, or if it's just it is just powerful and needs to be destroyed, is basically the gist of it. But there's not really a good way it can be used, and Gollum really only uses it to be sneaky, I suppose, and use it to disappear and all that. But it's the need for the ring that corrupts him, and it's a reflection, I would say, yes, of the opposite of Aragorn, where knowing his limits, Aragorn gives it away and says, I can't have it. Whereas Gollum says, it's the only thing that can complete me. Give it to me, and I need it now, and I need it always. I can't live without it. And it's sad, even though it's created such an iconic character, it's sad to see the Hobbit he once was turn into the creature he now is.
Props to Andy Serkis for like the incredible like voice casting, and just the fact that they actually made Gollum look creepy and like with CGI, because it's like, especially with the voice, because it's like,
we wants it, we wants the precious. No.
You do really good job at that voice, Will.
I will say, sometimes I've snuck up on my sisters while they're sleeping and done that in their ear, so it'll wake you up.
Stupid Hobbitses.
I would a little bit counter the point that Will made and say that Gollum isn't necessarily a picture of corrupted masculinity, but corrupted humanity in general. I think Gollum is supposed to be more of a picture of what obsession over sin leads to, obviously to an extreme degree. You know, people who are enslaved to sin, as we all are before we're saved, obviously don't become little gray creatures running around in the dark. But if you think about it, it is another one of those beautiful, more subtle allegories that Tolkien wove into his story, where the ring is such a small thing, and yet it holds such a huge power. And so often I think we can all see that in our own lives, where we see small sins, quote unquote, or habits that slowly consume us, where we need that thing in order to go about our day, and that thing pushes us into isolation more and more and more and more, and it pushes us into hiding, into the darkness, into where we're not interacting with other people. So I would argue that Gollum is less a picture of corrupted masculinity, but more just corrupted humanity in general, and essentially what happens to the individual person that sin really gets a hold of. And there's one line where before we really meet Gollum, Frodo and Gandalf are talking, and Frodo says,
"It's a pity Bilbo didn't kill him when he had the chance."
Pity? It was pity that stayed Bilbo's hand.
He's pitiful of this poor creature that's been so consumed by this thing that he spared him. And so I think it's one of those things that's maybe a little uncomfortable, but I think we can all see ourselves a little bit in the character of Gollum, in that just obsessiveness. And in the end, it's his obsession over this thing that leads to his death. Like he's so obsessed. And I think that's so beautiful in that shot where the ring gets destroyed, is he's literally falling to his death, and all he can do is cradle the ring to his chest, because that's all that matters to him. And only when he hits the lava does he realize what's happened. And I think that one of those scary things, that if we step back and we say, am I doing that? Like, as I fall deeper and deeper into this sin, do I not care? Because all I can see is how good this makes me feel in the moment before it all comes crashing down. So it's one of those a little more maybe uncomfortable things that we have to take a step back at and sort of reevaluate what that means in relation to our lives.
That's one of the more unique things about Lord of the Rings, is that not only did it establish 90% of all modern fantasy tropes, but it also holds up with a very unique ending, because it's kind of cliche to just imagine the hero defeating the bad guy. He goes on the quest, he stops, and that's also a mythical trope as well. What's interesting is that in the character of Gollum, you get to see the destructive power of the ring, because it represents total power and the obsession with that, to the point where Gollum, even though he tries to kind of get unleashed from it, he just can't detach himself from it, and so that totally warps his body, his mind, his spirit, and he becomes totally gross and decrepit because of that. But at the same time, it's also interesting that with the ending of the Lord of the Rings, it's very unique, because it's not the heroes that win. I mean, Frodo fails. They make it all the way there, and he succumbs to the lure of the ring. But it's also interesting because Tolkien kind of paints this weird portrait where it's Gollum, especially in the book as well, because in the movies it's a bit more of a tussle, but in the books it's Gollum gets the ring and he's so happy and jubilant that he jumps off the edge. But even in the films, that still kind of happens, where Gollum is the one who brings the destruction of the ring because of his obsession for it, because of his own desires for it. And I think I've watched this very interesting video essay where it talks about like that's kind of Tolkien's understanding of the nature of evil, where you can't defeat evil with evil. Like you can't like stop a war by being more brutal, by being more cunning or whatever, because that's only going to encourage more evil, more violence, and more bloodshed and stuff like that. And that's kind of like what the whole point of like you can't use the ring to stop Sauron. It's going to corrupt you. But it seems like with the ending of the Lord of the Rings, Tolkien's kind of making the point that the evil is going to inevitably destroy itself, and that's what Gollum's greed and his obsession destroys the ultimate power that Sauron has. It ultimately kills Sauron. Nothing else the heroes did. But it's more like, and also like you mentioned, Annika, the pity that Bilbo had, that's like a simple act of like compassion. And that's what Lord of the Rings is full of, like simple acts of compassion, people doing good things. And that's more or less what ultimately defeats Sauron, because that allows evil to destroy itself. And so I think it's a very nuanced and interesting conversation that Tolkien is like presenting with his ending and through the character of Gollum.
Yeah, there's also a line that Gandalf says where he says,
He hates and loves the ring, as he hates and loves himself.
and I think, you know, again, we can apply that to ourselves and we say, I don't know, say that you have this sin that you're holding on to, you hate it, but also you love it in the same way that sometimes you love yourself and sometimes you hate yourself. And that's just the nature of, just the nature of sin, and how without the power of God, like, we can't separate ourselves from it.
I just saw this quote today, like minutes before recording this. I posted it on my personal story. It's a short story. A young man mockingly said to a preacher, "You say that unsaved people carry a great weight of sin. Frankly, I feel nothing. How heavy is sin? 10 pounds, 50 pounds, 80 pounds, 100 pounds? Preacher thought for a moment and gently replied, "If you laid a 400-pound weight on a corpse, would it feel the load?" And the young man was quick to say, "Of course not, it's dead." And the preacher replied, "The person who doesn't know Christ is equally dead. And though the load is great, he feels none of it." Wow. Some good stuff. The weight of the ring was not something Gollum considered. He just knew that he had what he wanted and it was making him happy in the moment. And yet when it was taken away from him, he didn't know what to do. It's powerful and really interesting when you talk about it like that. I like those perspectives.
Yeah, a quote that it's from the Hobbit movies. I'm not sure if it's pulled from the books or if it's something that the writers came up with. But this is Gandalf speaking, and he says,
Saruman believes that it is only great power that can hold evil in check. But that is not what I have found. I found it is the small things, everyday deeds of ordinary folk that keeps the darkness at bay. Simple acts of kindness and love.
And that's one of those things that, like Will was, it's not ultimately the destruction of the ring that saved Middle Earth. It was the small acts of ordinary folk that keep the darkness at bay.
Speaking of small acts of ordinary folk, let's talk about the greatest character in all of Lord of the Rings history, and that's Samwise freaking Gamgee. He's so sweet, and everyone loves him for that. He's such a loyal friend. I think he embodies loyalty and friendship when it comes to knowing what Frodo's goal is and pushing him, keeping him going, making him stay on the right track. And I'm sure you guys have a lot of thoughts on Samwise, and so go at it.
You know, like, I think Tolkien is the one who said that, like, Samwise is the true hero of the Lord of the Rings, because, like, he never gives up, he never gives in. He's like one of the few people who actually actually has the ring in his possession in the books and even in the film, and he willingly gives it up, which is like crazy, unheard of, because everybody who gets it wants to hold on to it. And like he just like, and that's also speaks to the fact like Samwise is very humble, but at the same time he's also very strong, and that shows that those two virtues aren't necessarily incompatible, which I think is a very poignant note. But yeah, like Samwise, one of my favorite characters. Like I think when we did like the music episode, I mentioned that like one of my favorite scores of all time is like the part where Sam and Frodo are like on Mount Doom, and like Frodo's like, "Oh, it's too much," and like the music soars, and like Sam is like holding him, and Sam goes,
"Come on, Mr. Frodo, I can't carry it for you, but I can carry you. Come on!"
That's just one of my favorite quotes. 2, one of my favorite scores of all time. And 3, just one of my favorite scenes of all time, because it's just so inspirational. I love it so much.
I believe Sean Astin is a Christian, isn't he?
He is, yeah.
Yeah, because Sean Astin's been he's been in like a couple of like other Christian movies, hasn't he? Like in Mom's Night Out and a few other ones.
I remember him from Mom's Night Out, but I didn't know if that was just out of convenience or if he actually wanted to help all of that. Austin is set to narrate the upcoming comedy film Go West, the first theatrical film from the original cast from the sketch comedy show Studio C, produced by their own company JK Studios. So he's in cahoots with the OG Studio C cast. That's cool.
Well, first of all, I think Sean Astin, that's one of the best performances. I mean, all of the performances are top notch, but I think his stands out because maybe it's not the most memorable, maybe it's not like Viggo Mortensen doing all this crazy stuff, but it's so perfect and so beautiful in its simplicity. And I think that just really reflects the character of Sam, because I forget how it goes, but somewhere in the story, it's basically like he maybe wasn't the brightest, but he had a deeper wisdom because he wasn't puffed up with a sort of self-importance of any sort of intelligence. And I think that's where we get these beautiful monologues from Sam that make so much sense, because he's really just processing what he's going through, and the way he says it and the way he shares it just comes across so beautifully because it's simple and because it makes sense. Like his speech near the end of Two Towers always like brings me to the verge of tears, because it's just, well, one, it's beautifully written, so props to the writers and the way they adapted what Tolkien wrote to make it fit. But like even this darkness must pass, and when the sun shines out, it will shine out the clearer for having been through the darkness. All of those things are just so gorgeous, because we've all felt that. We've all felt like we're in this mess. He says, by rights, we shouldn't even be here, but we are. So what are we going to do about it? And I think that's one of those moments that is just like, always encourages me, you know, even though my daily struggles aren't quite so dramatic, of just thinking about how God's going to bring you through the little struggles, the big struggles, and when the sun shines out, it'll shine the clearer for having been through so much darkness.
And then the other two hobbits, Merry and Pippin, just obviously the comedic relief. They're so goofy, but yet they're still pivotal. Most of the time, the comedy relief is just that, the comedy relief. But they still have a role to play in the whole movie story, especially when they get split up. They can still be funny, but I especially think of when, I can't remember which one it is, but when he's up with Gandalf at the top of the tower and he feels useless because he's kind of locked away, and he has that great song. And I think, is it The Last Goodbye?
The Last Goodbye!
Oh, wrong one.
I saw the light fade from the sky.
No, Last Goodbye was written for Hobbit. Pippin sings Edge of Night.
Through shadow, to the edge of night, until the stars are all alight.
So The Edge of Night was in the movie, and then The Last Goodbye was by Billy Boyd, which is still a banger. It's so good, and their accents make it so much cooler. But yes, just those sad, almost contemplative, like they're just staring off into the distance and they're singing what they're thinking. It's really cool thought. Both The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit have a tone of being a musical in them. There's a lot more in The Hobbit, I think. That may be where the jovial, childlike tone comes from, but there's still songs in the other ones. It doesn't make it a musical, but it's normal to just start singing, and I think that brings a little bit of life to some of us theater kids who like musicals.
Coincidentally enough, there is, I know for a fact, a Lord of the Rings musical. I don't know much about it, but I know that there is one.
It wasn't very good from what I heard.
Okay.
I don't think The Lord of the Rings works for the stage for a lot of reasons. The Hobbit does, which is another discussion we can maybe talk about.
Sure.
I might be a little biased, but it's shorter, it's a little more digestible, it's not as expansive.
You're in The Hobbit.
Building one. I think Merry and Pippin go through a really cool character arc, especially in the movies. They are introduced as these pranksters who are just kind of joking around and then, you know, set off the firework and get in trouble, but they don't really care. And in the books, they go on the quest a little more purposefully. In the movies, they kind of just get drug along for the ride and then end up on this great adventure. But yeah, they do end up playing a pivotal role, and they also, I think, kind of similar to Sam, they discover their courage. And especially when they're so insistent on going into battle and fighting, they understand that they might not be the biggest or the strongest, but they know that they're going to do what they can to play a part in saving the world that they love. And I think that's just a really cool little character arc, from the selfish little boys who are stealing fireworks to these great men who, if I remember correctly, once they get back to the Shire, they become sort of like dukes or mayors and stuff, and are great leaders. They also the Entwater and get very, very tall, which I think is a funny subplot. But.
Well, and I love Hobbit names too. It's like took Bilbo Baggins, Merryweather.
It's very kind of staccato-y. It's so funny to see Billy Boyd and Dominic Monaghan still being best buddies. They have their own podcast, and they're just still loving life together. Yes, they've ridden the coattails of the Lord of the Rings a lot, but it's so funny to see them still riff together. It's so good. But yeah, you're right. I think they Merry and Pippin were the characters they were boys, and they learned what it meant to be a man. And I don't want to just harp on masculinity, but there's a lot of it in this movie and series. Whereas Sam is a loyal friend, and he's never willing to give up on Frodo or anyone else. And then Frodo is like, wants to do something but doesn't know how he can be used, and yet he just does a simple task and keeps one foot ahead of the other. Whereas Merry and Pippin, they just want second breakfast and third breakfast. Or what is it? But what about? It is second breakfast. But what about second breakfast?
Yeah, second breakfast. Luncheon, afternoon tea, dinner, supper, 11sies.
That's all they're concerned about. And then by the end, you just see they have such a character shift into a responsibility. They change and they turn into responsible men, and it's so cool to see that character arc. There's so many good character arcs. That's the whole point. Your characters are supposed to change throughout the story, and a lot of writers these days don't get that. It's so sad to just see your character go through something and end up the exact same on the other side. Do you guys think that the Lord of the Rings, all three movies, are one story? Because that's something when you look at trilogies or movies in a series, sometimes they are individual stories. And yes, it is like Frodo is given that push, that I don't know what it's called in the hero's journey, but he's called on the adventure, and then the adventure ends in the end of the third one. Obviously that's all one story, but is it really one story chopped up into 3 movies or 3 books, or can it be individual movies?
I'd say it's probably really one story in 3 parts, because especially for the second part, just take it for the movie format. If you watch the second Lord of the Rings film, I think you're going to be pretty confused and like, what? Because of how it ends and how it starts. I mean, I think you could maybe have like the third one be its own thing, possibly, because they have enough of a setup, and maybe even the first one, because I actually watched the first part of the Lord of the Rings, like the first film, and I didn't know that there wasn't really any other parts for it, and I didn't watch even all of the first one because Gollum freaked me out as a kid, and he still kind of does. But yeah, it's really one story, and I think that was clear from like when Tolkien started writing this, that he had an idea for how the story it just got really big, and so had to expand it into 3 parts, and they work pretty well as 3 junctures, because again, like the goal is completely to defeat Sauron, and they don't do that until the third film. And there's so many character moments and character arcs that aren't fulfilled until the third part, like for Eowyn, for example, and how she deals with things, and like Merry and Pippin, and what exactly they have to do in their role in this, and Aragorn and him becoming king and all that. So
I do agree that I believe it's one story, and I think it's best enjoyed in a sort of marathon format where you watch back to back. I think that's the fullest viewing experience. But I do think there is a piece where they were so well written to the point where each movie does have an inciting event, a climax, and then a falling action to some sort of a resolution, even if the resolution in the first 2 movies maybe doesn't resolve the story overall, but it resolves the action of that film. And it makes me think of sort of like, obviously Dune 1 was an incredible movie, but the end felt super abrupt because it was like, okay, and we're done. And I honestly think that one of my qualms with that movie is there wasn't really much of a climax to that one. And I think the same could go for Avengers, whatever the first one was called, in the Infinity War, is that that one was just, there wasn't that climax and then a resolution as much. It was just kind of sort of a climax and then just done.
Which was kind of the strength of Infinity War, but I think this is actually kind of maybe just a good point to talk slightly about the MCU, where the MCU has become so big and so vast, you have to watch all of it because it's all connected, which is a strength and a weakness. Well, that's the topic for another time, but just like for the MCU, it's like you have to like basically at this point have watched the entire previous like all of the movies in order to really get like for what's going on at this point. Like I think it'd be really hard to just jump into right now, MCU having never watched anything beforehand. Whereas again, like with like Lord of the Rings, even if you don't really have much of an idea, I think you can still get a good idea for like the films themselves, depending on when you jump in. Although ideally you'd want to start with the first story, so it's the first movie, so you get an idea for what's going on.
I think I disagree with you, just because I would not want to start with The Return of the King and not have seen the other two. I think I would be very lost. I think you need to have. I think you're right. It is one whole story. I think that Marvel movies can be enjoyed as well, if you enjoy them, as their own movies with hints at a bigger picture. I was thinking more of movies that aren't currently in production. I would contrast or compare to Star Wars. The original trilogy has inciting action, and yeah, they are individual movies. They have a story that travels from 4 through 6, but they still have a finish, and then you kind of are satisfied with that. And then you start it again, and you have another climb and a completion. Whereas, you're right, with Dune and with Lord of the Rings, it really just keeps going. Dune 1 felt like just Act 1, and then Dune Part 2 felt like Act 2 and 3 of the same story. And I think Lord of the Rings is a massive, maybe there's way more than 3 acts, but for the most part, those movies are Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, respectively. So there are some things that it is the biggest, possibly the biggest movie ever made, in the sense that it is a 12-hour movie that really, nothing is really wasted. Maybe you could say the addition of the love interests that weren't really in the books could be wasted time, but maybe you need more of that. I don't know. It depends on what you mean by adapting the book. Every single second of the movies was well used, I think. And it's just one massive story that's so fun to watch. And yes, I don't know how you can watch Fellowship and be like, oh yeah, I'll come back to it sometime. It's like you just watch the next ones and plan a whole day, make a thing of it. I know that's not a habit, tradition for you, Annika, to do Lord of the Rings Day, but it's really crazy, and it's become a staple. And we didn't even get to talk about like the technology advancements or the other parts of the story. So I think we're gonna have to do a part 2 to this, unless you guys have. Well, I do want to give you guys a chance to say anything else if you're thinking.
Yeah, I just think it's a master class in storytelling, in the fact of it is one story and they maintain that, but they still also give you resolution and conclusion at the end of each film. I think that's a very difficult line to walk, but it's one that they totally hit the mark on perfectly in a way that I don't think very many movies since then have been able to do.
Yeah.
Would you say Dune compares?
See, I don't know. A lot of people, at least going into Dune 2, a lot of people were like, this is the Lord of the Rings of our generation. And of course, I enjoyed the movie. I thought it was incredible. The performances were fantastic. Costume design, production design, VFX, everything was incredible. But there's just something special about the Lord of the Rings. And I think it's a sort of magic and a sort of authenticity that I don't think media will ever capture again, which is sad. But on the same hand, I'm like, I can always go back to the movies. I can always go back to the books. I can always go back to the behind the scenes making of films, which are honestly almost as fun as watching the movies, and just appreciate the world that was built and all of the people who dedicated years and years of their life to bringing it to life. And yeah, I think it was a once in a lifetime, once in a generational thing that I don't think will ever be captured again, but that's okay.
I think they tried with The Hobbit. They tried with The Hobbit like 10 years later, and it didn't really work. I think that's something to say.
And really, if you want to like look at an example of how adapting something is so, like, in my opinion, very rarely ever done effectively, just look at The Hobbit versus Lord of the Rings, because they're by the same director and they're on relatively like similar sources that they're using in regards to like the same author and like the same books, like with the same feel and a lot of the same actors even. But even though I don't really have too much of a bone to pick against The Hobbit, I can definitely tell the Lord of the Rings is just better quality. And Annika, you like mentioned like the Dune versus Lord of the Rings, and I think another thing that's really special about Lord of the Rings is that you talk about like the magical feel to it. That's because like Lord of the Rings is very, again, mythical, but it's also, consider who it's being written by and kind of for what. Like, again, it's written by Tolkien, who's a very passionate Catholic and Christian, and that influence of like good defeating evil, heroes going on a quest united and stopping something, and evil destroying itself and going through trials. I think that's more compelling and more long lasting, where Dune is much more about a critique of like the messianic figure and about religions and like the rise of charismatic leaders, because Dune was written from a different perspective by Frank Herbert, and like Tolkien, for instance, actually didn't like Dune himself. So I think there is definitely something to be said about the fact that like we really did get lightning in the bottle with Lord of the Rings, in that they just somehow did capture the essence of the books and translated that for a wider audience so that people could enjoy the story. And, you know, even just like more recent attempts with like the Rings of Power, it's just not worked as effectively, and I don't think they will. And that's, again, kind of sad, but at the same time, it's really impressive just to see the legacy that Tolkien has left and how impactful it still is. And yeah, I know that for sure I'm going to keep on enjoying them for the rest of my life.
Yeah, it's definitely something you keep revisiting. It's so good, so much fun to watch. Speaking of revisiting, we will have to revisit more aspects of this in a part 2 sometime in the future, because it's just, I knew we probably wouldn't get through it, but there's just so much to this movie. It's up for the outro. You need the full beard, though. You need the full beard to complete the look, Annika.
Oh, it was just a mustache, don't you?
Oh, you just had a mustache? I'm going to throw a video on the screen of Annika playing Gimli. No, not Gimli.
Feely.
I'm sorry. I'm playing a Hobbit in The Hobbit. It's really funny, really goofy. Little clip of her, but that's where her hood is from. Thank you guys so much for listening or watching. Make sure to follow us on all our socials. Make sure to do all the things that I mentioned in the other episodes that I've said no number of times and you don't need to hear me say again. That's all I'll say. All right.
You shall hit the subscribe button. I don't know. like in every like video, but they always have like stay in character and like use like the theme of the video in order to like get people to hit that like and spell and subscribe.
Annika, you're more giving off. What's his name? What do they call him? What do they call Aragorn in the Fellowship right away?
Strider.
You're giving off Strider vibes.
Strider.
Yeah. All right. Until next week, know that you're loved. God bless.
Have faith and keep on and carry on, brothers.
That's not what it was last week.
No.
Where there's a will, there's a way.
I'm working on it.
Okay.
Yeah, but I don't know. Does that one actually sound better? Because I was thinking about it. I'm working on it.
I like it.
We're live testing.
You don't need to have an outro. It's just funny.
Getting positive feedback.
Okay, that's good. All right, peace.